Hello YouTubers and welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha from the new location. Welcome to the study, I should say. So I haven't been lying for the past few weeks. I have been moving house. This is why the videos have not been as frequent as they have been in the past. So busy with the move, but as you can see, I'm now in new digs. He's still here, hogging the limelight as always. And this is it. This is where the new videos are going to be broadcast from now on. So, recorded and broadcast from here. So let's go. So what am I looking at today? I thought I'd look at a cult series, a little known but fondly remembered by me series from 1996 from BBC Two, and it's this here. This is my double DVD disc collection of Neverwhere.
He stumbled into a parallel London.
Why did you have to come here?
And now he must brave its most dangerous neighborhood.
Knightsbridge.
Knightsbridge.
A bodyguard can protect his back, but who'll guard his dreams?
Now is the time to be afraid of the dark.
Neverwhere. Urban fantasy. Thursday at 9 on BBC Two.
Welcome aboard.
Neverwhere was written by Neil Gaiman. It was a fantasy series broadcast at a time on the BBC when the BBC weren't really doing much fantasy work. It was that interim period where Doctor Who was off the air. It had been cancelled in '89, and it was a good decade before the BBC decided to bring it back. Had this series been made now or over the past decade, I think it would have... it would be more fondly remembered now. It would have much more kudos. It would probably have had a better budget than it had because, it was really made on the cheap. It didn't really have a budget. One of the mandates for the series apparently was that it was going to be shot on video, the same as the latter era Doctor Who. Instead of the BBC really giving reverence to a programme that was really its flagship programme through the 60s and 70s. I'm talking Doctor Who here. In the mid-80s, at a time when they really should have been upping the budgets and upping the production values on Doctor Who, and having it maybe switching to having it shot entirely on film, they went the other way and they had it shot entirely on video.
Careful!
Sorry. What are we doing here anyway?
Looking for George Stevenson. You are dead, Doctor. Goodbye, Doctor.
So the series took on a far cheaper look than it really should have had, which is why it really, towards the end of its life, it really sort of garnered a camp value because of the cheap, nasty, almost naff look that the series had, which is probably largely why a writer like Russell T Davies was charged with bringing it back when it did come back in 2005 because of that camp value. Neil Gaiman, the fantasy writer, is a big Doctor Who fan. Indeed, he's written for Doctor Who since its return in 2005. And you can see it here. I mean, there's Neverwhere contains a character called the Marquis de Carabas, who Neil Gaiman describes as being what he would like in the Doctor Who.
Exactly what kind of favour?
A really big one. She said she'd have to owe you a really big favour.
Did you leave her on her own?
Yes.
With Croup and Vandemar out there? Well, what are you waiting for? Come on! I need to get her to the market. The next one's in 2 days' time, if I recall correctly. As of course I unfailingly do. I can hide her until then.
Market.
The floating market. But you don't want to know about that.
But why?
No more questions.
What was I saying? Yeah, so the Marquis de Carabas was really Neil Gaiman's version of what he would have liked to have seen in a Doctor Who. Indeed, Patterson Joseph would have made a good Doctor Who. I think he was in the first series of the Return programme.
Goodbye.
Don't try to escape. It's play or die.
And I know that Stephen Moffat has said that he did offer the role of the Doctor to a man of colour. He never stated who it was, but I've long suspected that it was Patterson Joseph. It would have made sense as well, because it was under the guideship of Stephen Moffat that Neil Gaiman wrote his episodes for Doctor Who, and so I can only imagine that he would have probably championed Patterson Joseph for the role of the Doctor, having worked with him in the past on Neverwhere. So yeah, the initial series was made and broadcast in by the BBC in 1996. Only 6 episodes were made. I avidly watched it. I got hooked into it from the first episode onwards, and tuned in every week, because I think this is a really engaging story, Neverwhere. And if there's one thing going for it, it's the story. It's Neil Gaiman's writing and imagination being written on screen. It didn't really have the budget or the production values to fully realise his vision, sadly. For the amenities that they had on to hand at the time, I think they did a pretty good job. When you watch the whole 6, you can see it was obviously set up for more series down the line, more series that sadly never got made. Plot threads are left unopened. There is a cliffhanger. Well, not really a cliffhanger ending, but the character of Dor. In the first episode, her family, you think, gets wiped out, but right at the end, the villain, just before his demise, reveals that her sister is still alive. So that was obviously a setup for further instalments down the line. Also, there was a sort of will they, won't they romance between Richard Mayhew, the central protagonist, and Dor. That was never really fully realised, or even hinted at that it would be a romance, but it seemed an obvious way to go with the characters to have these two get together.
And I've sort of got to quite like having you around. Please don't go.
Well, I've got to sort of quite like having you around too. But I don't belong here.
Then we won't ever see each other again.
Suppose we won't.
Neil Gaiman said that had they done more series, that would have been something that would be fleshed out in later series. Part of the reason he said he didn't give them a fully fledged romance as well is because they didn't know what age they were going to cast the character of Dor. They could have cast her as young as 14 or 15, in which case it wouldn't have been appropriate for them to have a fully fledged romance if it had been a 15-year-old girl and Gary Bakewell, who was I think in his late 20s when he made the series. So what's interesting about the series is that in conjunction to writing the TV scripts, Neil Gaiman also wrote it as a novel, and he put everything that he couldn't get into the series through budgetary or time constraints. He took all that stuff and put it into the novel, and really it's become more widely known, I think, over the years as a novel rather than a TV show. Interestingly enough, the novel was published at the same time as the TV series was broadcast. I never actually read the novel until literally a month ago. I got it for Christmas for the first time. But I did have the audiobook version, or at least an abridged audiobook version, with Gary Bakewell, who plays Richard in the series, narrating it and doing impressions of all the cast through it. And so it was really, because I didn't have the TV series on video or anything. I bought this about a decade ago, and that was really the first time for about 10 or 12 years that I'd actually sat down and watched the series for a second time. But it stuck in my head because I had the audiobook version and I'd listened to that so much that it's funny that I've often cited it as one of my favourite novels, despite the fact that I'd never really read the novel until recently. A little background on the series. It was initially not Gaiman's idea at all. It was initially Lenny Henry's idea. Lenny Henry really has a reputation now of being a kind of... he's a comedian, but he's not really... the cool, respectable choice when you talk about alternative comedy. Indeed, he never really started in an alternative comedy. He was more Mr. Light Entertainment. He first appeared on the scene in Opportunity Knocks, I think, and it was only latterly that he, when the alternative comedy scene of the 1980s came along, the comic strip, Rick Mail and Aid Edmondson, and comedy got a bit more punk, that he really latched onto that.
You have come bottom in the whole world. Hooray!
Who came top out of us?
You did, Neil. Then Mike, then Vivian, then Rick. You bloody little swat, Neil! You bloody little swat!
So it's funny because he kind of has this reputation as being Mr. Light Entertainment. There is a cool side to Lenny Henry that I discover every now and again. Part of that cool also stems from the fact that he's apparently a massive comic book fan, and that's how he discovered Neil Gaiman, because Neil Gaiman is a comic book writer. He's probably most famous for writing for DC Comics in America and writing the Sandman series. And indeed, I discovered the Sandman series of comics through Neverwhere. I really engaged with the writing and the storytelling on display in Neverwhere when I first watched it. So through that, I went and seeked out the Sandman series. Didn't initially take to it at first, I must admit. It took me a couple of goes, but once I thought, no, I'm going to sit down and properly give this a go, and I read the entire 75 issue run over the course of a couple of years, and by the time I'd finished it had long been established in my mind as actually one of the greatest things I've ever read in any medium. DC Comics and their more adult orientated wing, Vertigo Comics, were really the spearheaders of the movement that happened in the 1980s to create a more adult orientated comic book scene, graphic novel scene, if you will. And the three names that everyone puts at the forefront of this revolution are Alan Moore with his comic book Watchmen, which was the first superhero book that dealt with very, very adult themes. Frank Miller's the other one with The Dark Knight Returns, which again did a similar sort of thing, but took an established comic book hero, in this case Batman, but gave him the sort of reverence and the maturity that you'd expect for writing for adults for the first time. And the other name that's at the forefront of this revolution is, of course, Neil Gaiman with The Sandman, which, to all intents and purposes, is literature. It's literature, but done in the comic book medium, and it was really the first time that had happened, and is arguably a far more mature adult work than Neverwhere. Neverwhere seems light in comparison. It almost feels like a children's series, thanks in no small part to the look of the series. The fact that it's shot on video, and it has a sort of box of delights. The children agreed no look to it. Neil Gaiman has said that from about 1996 to 2005, when the series was only available on sort of bootleg copies that people had initially taped off the TV, and then the subsequent copying of all the and the degeneration of the image actually meant that the image sort of improved over time because of the degeneration of the image.
Well, very impressed with your skills.
I thought you were hiring professionals, not competent amateurs. I'm here to audition.
Now, the version that you can get is the version that really should have been available initially. It's the version that's been put through the film filter, and I think the frame rate has been taken down from 24 frames per second to 22, so it gives it a far cooler image now than it initially had.
Very well. I have to fight her.
Yes. Unless you'd like a little lie down first.
But take it from me, I can remember at the time watching it and thinking, wow, this would be great if it didn't look like shit. Why they made it look so cheap on its initial broadcast, I don't know, and it didn't do the series any favours, sadly. So the plot of the show, it's one of the most imaginative fantasy ideas, really. It basically involves the main character, Richard Mayhew, coming into contact with a girl called Dor, who he finds injured on the street. She's got two mercenary killers called Mr. Krupp and Mr. Vandermar, sort of gentlemanly killers after her.
Don't think of us as murderers and cutthroats. Think of us as an escort service.
Only without the bosoms.
You see, Lady Dor, we have been appointed to make sure you get safely to your destination.
Dor's comes from a family whose special power is they can open any door, unlock any door that they come into contact with. It's really, and this was, so she sort of sucks Richard Mayhew into the world of London Below. And London Below is really a sort of fantasy parallel universe to the London that we know, that lives in conjunction, but most people sort of walk past it and don't see it. And indeed, the homeless of London are actually meant to be the residents of London below. So there's a bit of social commentary, a bit of social satire going on in the setup, and it's really the adventures that Richard Mayhew has when he falls through the cracks and ends up in London below. What makes this fun is the fun that Gaiman has with all the established London names and cliches. Like, for example, there's a character called the Angel Islington, and he's an actual angel.
Come in, Richard Mayhew, come in. I was rather hoping you would grace us with your presence. Look at me, you do look a mess.
There's another character called Old Bailey.
Old Bailey! What a delightfully unexpected surprise running into you here.
You're not wanted here, the Carabas. Get away.
There's another character who lives on a tube train, but a tube train that no one ever gets on, called Earl's Court. And he is actually an earl, and the court is located on the tube train.
Go on. Say something funny.
My hound hath no nose.
At one point they go to a monastery called Blackfriars, and it's inhabited entirely by monks who are all black. You know, another Lenny Henry idea that made it onto screen.
We've lost the key. God help us all.
So Lenny Henry, in spearheading this, you know, it was his film company, Crucial Films, that said he wanted to do a fantasy series set in London about the homeless, and he drafted in Neil Gaiman to write this thing. Neil Gaiman was initially hesitant to write a fantasy series about the homeless because he was worried that he thought he might make being homeless really cool, and he kind of did to some extent, really. There's a character called Lamia who's like, who's to all intents and purposes, she's kind of a 90s goth chick, but she's also a kind of vampire. She sucks the life force out of people. Not a vampire with fangs, but she sucks the life force out of people and makes them go cold. The idea apparently for Lamia stemmed from the fact that he only ever saw goth chicks at night. Of course, the reason for this is because they'd only ever get made up in their gothy makeup and their bodices at night and go out clubbing. And he'd only ever see them on the tube train at night. But he thought, wouldn't it be fun if they were just like a vampire race, basically? So, what I love about this series is it's a fairly standard fantasy story structure, and the character archetypes are very standard fantasy character archetypes. You know, you have the protagonist, you have the princess, the damsel in distress, you have the guide, the kind of mentor character, you have the warrior type, and you have the villains as well. But and indeed, there's allusions made to the Wizard of Oz. You know, Lamia, who's possibly the most self-aware meta character in the thing. She says at one point,
"And he'll give you brains and me a heart."
You know, she's the only character that realises that they're in the Wizard of Oz. So, although you have these very standard characters and very standard, hero saving the princess and fulfilling his destiny fantasy storyline, it's all offset by a very original setting and in a very imaginative setting. It's not a simple Tolkien-esque fantasy world. Having it exist as the characters say in the show, contemporaneously with the London that we all know, gives it a very original feel. But like I say, it was just broadcast at the wrong time. I think I'd say 1986 to 2004 was just a dry bed desert for sci-fi and fantasy on the BBC. It was considered kind of silly, and they were far more interested in making kitchen sink dramas and worthy dramas about real working class lives or real lives in general, and realism was very much at the fore, which is sad really, because obviously I was a fantasy fan, and all the films I watched growing up as a teenager were fantasy. So why the BBC television couldn't be doing really great fantasy and sci-fi stuff, I never really understood. And so indeed, when something like Neverwhere came along, I was there championing it to the hilt. But like all great cult series, they only made the one, and the fact that there was no second series, I think that went a long way to lending it its cult status. I mean, I don't. It's hard to say, because I'm almost hesitant to say this is a cult series, because I have shown it to. I know there are fans of this out there. There's certainly fans of the books from what I've seen on YouTube, but this is more of an appraisal of the TV show than the book. Although I do recommend the book. The book is a very fun read. But indeed, this isn't liked by everyone. I wouldn't say this is a series for everyone, or it's certainly not a series that everyone's going to enjoy. I have shown this to a few people, and they've come back and said, "What is this? This is rubbish," And okay, fair enough. If you think it's rubbish, yeah, I can totally see why you would see that. But I don't know. I really get caught up in the story when every couple of years I put this on, and I think this is a brilliant story, well told. There is apparently, Gaiman has said he's now, after 20 years, finally in the process of writing the sequel. The sequel's called The Seven Sisters, and it will be coming out in book form now. So finally, at last, we're going to see the sequel to. Because I've been waiting 20 years now to see the further adventures of Richard Mayhew and Dor and the Marquis de Carabas. All we've really got in that time has been one short story from Gaiman called How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, which is really based on a continuity error, because when the Marquis returns at the end of the series, he's magically got his coat back despite losing it at the midway point.
Coming.
But apparently very soon we're going to be getting a full novel, and I guess what would be the equivalent of another 6 episodes in book form, sadly, but not in TV form. But you never know. It might get adapted into a TV series or another TV series, or there might be another take on the material one day. I know there was a radio version a couple of years ago with a pretty good cast, actually. He had James McAvoy in it as Richard Mayhew, and Benedict Cumberbatch as the Angel Islington, Natalie Dormer as Dor.
Richard, are you listening?
Avidly. There is a key. The Black Friars are its custodians. What do we do? Find it. Bring it to me.
So, who knows? We might see another version of this come along one day with the budget that it always deserved. But until then, we've got the original, and I think even if it did get the Game of Thrones treatment now, I think the original's always going to have a special place in my heart. And there's also been talk of a movie as well, for ages as well. Apparently the rights have been with the Weinstein companies. Oh dear. But they were also with the Jim Henson Company as well for a long while. And I mean, if anything, they'll do the Beast of London very well. I sometimes try and dream up my fantasy cast for things and my fantasy dream cast, if you're interested, it would be James McAvoy, who played Richard Mayhew in the radio series. I'd have him as. I think you won't get anyone better really for Richard Mayhew if you made the film now. Dor, I'd have Daisy Ridley, Marquis de Carabas, Idris Elba, Hunter. I forget her name, but the girl who plays Moneypenny in the current Bond movies, I'd have her. Croup and Vandermeer, probably Stephen Graham as Mr. Croup and Tom Hardy as Mr. Vandermeer. The Angel Islington, I'd probably go for, because the Angel's described as having a sort of androgynous look, so it could be played by a man or a woman. So maybe Gwendolyn Christie is the Angel Islington, and Lamia, Lady Gaga. Yeah, so I really want to. The idea behind making this video was just to champion this, because I think it should be more widely known than it is. It's something that I really enjoy, and this is me. Instead of recommending it, really, it's really me just enthusing about it and putting something that I love out there. I don't know why no one else seems to love this series as much as I do, but there you go. This is one for me now. Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, a fine series if you ask me. But yeah, until next time, folks, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see everyone out there in YouTube land. Neil Gaiman describes as being what he would like in the Doctor Who, a sort of Doctor Who with its own agenda, and I've got two old biddies staring at me through the window now. This is going to be a problem from here on in. Sorry, distractions all around. These walls are very thin, which is why I'm keeping the timbre of my voice down as well. Sorry, I shouldn't get distracted. What was I saying? Yeah.